Welcome to Too Fond of Books. My name is Janelle, and in this March Mystery Madness video, I want to tell you about 3 Agatha Christie's that I've read recently. I am doing, in case you don't know, I am doing a Agatha Christie read-through project. I love Agatha Christie. I've read many of her books, but not all of them. And so I thought it would be fun if I did a project where I read through her books in chronological order and just watched for certain things. I'm fascinated by the Agatha Christie universe, whether or not her characters in her various series know each other. Is there any crossover between those characters? I like to look for things like what kind of a detective are her detectives. So for example, I've been figuring out that Hercule Poirot is a truth seeker, that's more important to him than justice when he is investigating crimes. And I've learned that Miss Marple is all about justice. She is like Nemesis, the goddess of retribution. Justice is very important to her. So I just like to look for stuff like that. So I will be reviewing the 3 books that I've read recently, upcoming in this video, but first I need to tell you about the book that I found that meets the prompts from yesterday's M&M manuscript matchup game. And that was to find a book written or set between 1950 and 1980 and that has a female detective. And since this is an Agatha Christie video, I had to go with The Mirror Cracked from Side to Side by Agatha Christie. This is a Miss Marple that takes place in St. Mary Mead, and this was published in 1962. What's interesting here is that it is 1962 and the changes that are coming to the village are part of this story, which I find fascinating. The modernization of the village is a bit distressing to some of the occupants, and there is an event at the big house that is now owned by a glamorous movie star, and then someone dies at that event, and of course Miss Marple needs to investigate. And so Miss Marple, of course, is our female detective. So that's The Murder Cracked from Side to Side. Okay, so I will just going to tell you heads up here as I talk about these books. I will begin by just giving a brief overview of the book and some of my initial thoughts, and then I'm going to go into some detail. And for those parts, I'm going to put spoiler across the screen because I don't want to be restricted in what I'm talking about. So if it's a book that you haven't read yet and you don't want to be spoiled for anything, then you will want to fast forward until you don't see spoiler on the screen anymore. So you will get to hear stuff about the book. I won't spoil anything until I've let you know that that's about to happen. So I read Easy to Kill, or Murder is Easy. This was published in 1939, possibly 38 or 39. It was a little hard to tell. Both dates were on the copyright page. This is considered one of the Superintendent Battle books. We met him first in The Secret of Chimneys, and he was also in the 7 Dials mystery. And so this is one of the, I call it a standalone, because even though Superintendent Battle is in this book, he is not a prominent character and he is not the detective who investigates the crimes. He just comes in at the end as the official police officer to wrap things up. So the detective in this one is actually a retired police officer who has come back from India. Luke, that's his name. And he's just returned to England, and he gets into an interesting conversation with a woman on a train. And then he reads in the newspaper that that woman has died in what seems like an accident. And his conversation with her was intriguing enough that he goes to her village to investigate what's happening. And so part of their conversation, this is a quote, and she says to him, no, my dear boy, that's where you're wrong. It's very easy to kill, so long as no one suspects you. And you see, the person in question is just the last person anyone would suspect. So one thing that I did enjoy about this book is that Agatha Christie decided to address that trope of the least likely person. She addresses it head on in this book, and it's fascinating. So a few pages later, he is talking to a friend of his called Jimmy, and he says to him, "I wonder if that's true, Jimmy. I wonder if it is. What? Easy to kill." All right, so now I want to get into some stuff, so this will become the spoilery section. But first, I just wanted to say that this was enjoyable. I like Agatha Christie. I like all Agatha Christie's, but this is not my favorite of hers. I gave it 3 stars. I liked it, but I didn't love it. It was good, but it's just not going to be one of my favorites. All right, so let's get into some details here and dig a little bit into how she addressed this least likely person trope in the book. All right, so here's another quote. I kind of made a note of any time people were mentioning whether it's easy or addressing the least likely person idea. So Luke says, "So it boils down to the fact that it's really quite easy to remove 3 human beings without anyone suspecting. So there's been 3 deaths, but nobody realizes that they're murder. They're all considered accidents." And then Luke again says, "This job isn't going to be exactly easy." He's talking with Dr. Thomas, a doctor in the village, who says, "It's quite easy, you know." And Luke says, "What is?" "To get away with it," says the doctor. I'm going to come back to this in a minute, but first, I did also notice this one quote, which I thought was so fascinating, because I thought Luke could easily be talking about Miss Marple here. Now, there's no indication that he knows Miss Marple, but what he's talking about here describes Miss Marple perfectly. He says, "Every man should have ants. They illustrate the triumph of guesswork over logic. It is reserved for ants to know that Mr. A is a rogue because he looks like a dishonest butler they once had. Other people say, reasonably enough, that a respectable man like Mr. A couldn't be a crook. The old ladies are right every time." So I loved that. At this point, there have been 2 Miss Marple books published. One is a short story collection and one is a full-length novel. But that right there, I just thought totally describes Miss Marple. So I thought it was interesting reading this book with this concept of the least likely person, because she addresses it in the book that the killer is the least likely person. But I also thought it was really interesting that she also made the detective the least likely person, because the obvious and overt detective in this story is Luke, who is a retired police officer who is actually investigating. But in the end, it's Bridget who gets it right, not Luke. And so there is an argument to be made that she's the least likely detective, the least likely person. And then what I loved too is, to bringing it all together, is then she then had a showdown between the least likely person killer and the least likely person detective at the end of the book. So that was that was really satisfying, actually. Miss Wainfleet says, "So easy, but the whole thing has been easy. I would hardly have believed it." And then later Bridget says, "Easy? This was easy too. She'd done it as a secretary for years." And then we're back to Miss Wainfleet. "Oh, it was quite easy. It just needed organization. The whole thing was so easy." And then right at the very end of the book, Luke says, "Well, I'm not much of a policeman. I never suspected Honoria Wainfleet once." So yeah, so this was a fun look at the least likely person trope. So the story itself isn't my favorite Agatha Christie, but I did still enjoy it, and I did think it was really interesting that Agatha Christie went with, it kind of played around with that idea of the least likely person. All right, One other interesting thing, and this is just about my particular edition of, I got this secondhand, and the person who owned this book previously had a huge problem with redundancy because they crossed out anything that they considered redundant in the text, and it's hilarious because it's all throughout the book. The previous owner crossed out reflexive pronouns and any other repetitive words. And so a perfect example is here. I've marked this because there are 5 times that words have been crossed out in pen in the book. So for example, my own partner, and the person crossed out own. Dr. Thomas shrugged his shoulders. They've crossed out his shoulders. Ellsworthy followed her up to London. They've crossed out up. I'm going up to London tomorrow. Crossed out up. And have you got ants yourself, Thomas? And crossed out yourself. So this person had a huge problem with redundancy. It was pretty hilarious. Okay, moving on. I also read And Then There Were None, which is the next up in the chronological read through. And this is from 1939, 1940. And Then There Were None. So this is an absolute classic. This has become the gold standard of isolated closed circle mysteries. This is a standalone novel, and there are no connections that I've found to any other characters from any of Agatha Christie's other books. So you have 10 strangers who are invited to spend the weekend on a private island, and they go and they all start dying. And it's wonderful, and it's brilliant, and it's fantastic, and I loved it, and I gave it 5 stars, and it is going to be in my top 5 of favorite Agatha Christie's. But there is such genius in here, and I feel like I need to get into it. So, spoiler time. If you have not read And Then There Were None, fast forward until you don't see the spoiler on the bottom of the screen anymore. And so let's just get right into it. The book opens with an introduction of each of the 10 strangers on their way to the island. So they are traveling by car or by train. The island is off the coast of Devon, and so they've been told that they will be picked up and taken by boat out to the island. So you meet each character at the very beginning as they are traveling in. And the very, very first character that we meet is Mr. Justice Wargrave. He is introduced and mentioned, even just mentioned in the very first sentence, and he is a retired judge. All of the characters have been invited to the island by a Mr. or Mrs. Owen, and the first initials in either case are U and N. And nobody has met either one, Mr. or Mrs. Owen. Nobody has ever met them. They received introductions or invitations by letter. All right. And then someone had made a comment that it's an oddly assorted party, and that's totally true. So, I mean, who are these 10 people, and how are they connected to each other? So they arrive on the island, and they have dinner on their first evening there, and after dinner, they're having drinks in the lounge or whatever, and suddenly they all hear the voice, and it's a record player that has been turned on. Ladies and gentlemen, silence please. You are charged with the following indictments. And then they go on to address every person who is there and charges them with murder. Prisoners at the bar, have you anything to say in your defense? So one thing that I find super fascinating about this book is that when people read it, they are completely surprised by who the killer turns out to be. And since we're in the spoilery section, I'm just going to go with it. It's the judge. It's Justice Wargrave. Everybody is so surprised by that, even though right from the very beginning, it's been so clear that it's all about justice and judgment and judges. So the very first character we meet is the judge. And when the record starts, it sounds like you're in a courtroom. Prisoners at the bar, ladies and gentlemen, you've been charged with the following indictments. Like, it's just like, it's so obvious that it's someone connected with the law, that it's a judge. And so then I started watching for if there were anyone talking about, if there was anyone talking about judgment or judging, and there were. So one of the characters, after the record stopped, said, "That voice, like a judgment," right? There was also references to the day of judgment a couple of times. So that is very interesting. Emily Brent is reading a passage about judgment in the Bible before she goes down to dinner. So that, I thought that was really, really interesting. Then I found there was a pretty big clue early on page 30. This is from the judge's perspective. So one great thing is you kind of get into the minds of all of these characters that are on the island. It's told in third person omniscient, so you get kind of to hear from everybody. And at this point, we're with the judge, and he's thinking, Harley Street ones are the worst of the lot, doctors. And his mind dwelt malevolently on a recent interview he had had with a suave personage in that very street. That right there is a massive clue. And because Agatha Christie is so brilliant, you pretty much miss it on your first read through. But that is a huge clue that maybe the judge is ill, and that he wants to take care of some business before he dies. So each room in this house on the island has a rhyme posted on the wall, and it's the 10 little soldiers, and they all have that rhyme, and it ends with, "and then there were none." And then on the dining room table there are some figures, and there are 10 figures, and after every death one of the figures is gone. So I mean, it's such a great way to build tension and suspense, and it's also super creepy. So the killer has decided to use this nursery rhyme and tries to kill each person by each verse as closely as he can. And the reason for it seems to be, and here is a quote, "There are crimes that cannot be brought home to their perpetrators." So it's about someone who feels that justice has not been served, that these are people who have not been held accountable for their crimes. The judge nodded gently. He said, "Oh yes, I've no doubt in my own mind that we have been invited here by a madman, probably a dangerous, homicidal lunatic." I think that's hilarious. So everybody is expecting the boat to arrive the next morning. The first person dies after dinner, and then by the next morning another person has died as well, supposedly in their sleep. So everybody is ready to go, but the boat does not arrive the next morning. And then a storm hits. So now they are completely isolated on this island, no way to get off, and they know that help is not coming at all. So once again, she's just ratcheting up the tension and the suspense. I find it interesting that this is on page 101. So we're more than halfway through the book, and Lombard at that point tells Vera that he thinks that it's a judge, and that it's the judge, that all of his power when he was a judge in the courts has gone to his head. So I just think it's so brilliant. And then I love that Justice Wargrave a couple of times makes sure to highlight the fact that if someone has died, any of those that are already dead are acquitted. They have to be innocent because they're dead. And so he's kind of like putting that thought into everybody's minds, because of course Justice Wargrave is supposedly the 5th person to die, and so he wants it firmly in their minds that he must be innocent because he is dead. And obviously we know from the end of the book that he fakes his death. It's not real, but of course everybody thinks that it is. And then the next person to die is Dr. Armstrong, but he doesn't die, he vanishes. And that's the verse in the poem that talks about a red herring takes him away. And so that is absolutely brilliant, because he does turn out to be a red herring, but not in the way that people were expecting him to be. So he's gone missing, he vanishes, so everybody that's left, and there's only 3 people left, assume that it's the doctor that is the killer, and so it was just brilliant on the judge's part to do that, because they now think that it's the doctor, and then the tension just keeps ratcheting up and things go crazy after that. And then I find it interesting that the judge talking about, if you're dead, you must be innocent, that's worked. Because Lombard says that himself after they find the judge's body. It's Lombard who says, well, there's another one who's innocent. So yeah, I just thought that was so brilliant. I absolutely loved that the judge set it up so that at the very end, whoever arrives on the island is going to find 10 dead people and no answers. And I just think that's so brilliant. So you have a chapter at the very end of the book of the police saying, what happened out there? Like, how do you have 10 dead people on an island? What happened to these people? I think it was so brilliant. And then, of course, because the judge needs somebody to know how clever he is, he writes a confession and puts it in a bottle and throws it in the sea. And so he still leaves it up to chance whether or not that bottle is ever found, whether his confession will ever be read. So yeah, I just think that this book is genius, absolutely genius. Now I marked a couple of passages just because I thought they were so good. So this is such a great example of the ratcheting tension, the suspense. They went up the stairs. The next move was a little like a scene in a farce. Each one of the 4 stood with a hand on his or her bedroom door handle. Then, as though at a signal, each one stepped into the room and pulled the door shut. There were sounds of bolts and locks, of the moving of furniture. 4 frightened people were barricaded in until morning. So good. When the sea goes down, there will come from the mainland boats and men, and they will find 10 dead bodies and an unsolved problem on Soldier Island. That is the last page of the killer's confession. It is so good. Okay, and then to end, I read the Regatta Mystery, which is a collection of short stories. There are 9 short stories in here. Some Poirot, some Parker Pyne, a Miss Marple, and a standalone. And this was really fun. It's interesting because I've discovered that I like short stories more than I thought that I did. So the Regatta Mystery is a Parker Pyne short story. So you have a bet that is made during a dinner that a diamond can be stolen in front of everybody. Now, there is something interesting here that I wanted to mention. This short story was originally published in magazines in both the States and Canada in 1936, but the detective was Poirot. And then Agatha Christie replaced Poirot with Parker Pyne for the US collection, The Regatta Mystery, and other stories that came out in 1939. Isn't that fascinating? Why did she change the detectives? That's so interesting. The original Poirot version is included in an omnibus that came out in 2008 called Hercule Poirot, The Complete Short Stories. So I just think that's fascinating. Then there's a Poirot short story called The Mystery of the Baghdad Chest. Mr. Clayton is found killed in a chest in somebody else's house. And that one was really good. That one, of course, there is mention of order and method and psychology, which is classic with Hercule Poirot. Then there's another Poirot story called How Does Your Garden Grow? From 1935. And in this one, we have Miss Lemon as his secretary. And this is the earliest mention of Miss Lemon as a secretary to Poirot. Previously, and we're pretty sure that it's the same Miss Lemon from the Parker Pine stories and that one was published a couple years before this short story. Poirot receives a letter, and then the sender of that letter dies, and so Poirot, of course, has to investigate. This is one that has a nursery rhyme, which is classic for Agatha Christie, and also there's a lot in there about the truth, which is important to Poirot. And then we have The Problem at Palenza Bay, which is another Parker Pine. This was originally published in 1936 in a magazine in the UK and in the US. Parker Pine is on holiday in Majorca, but despite being on holiday, he gets involved in a little matter of the heart. And then we have another Poirot story called Yellow Iris. This was originally published in 1937. Poirot heads to a club after receiving an intriguing telephone call. Interesting thing about that story is that Agatha Christie turned it into a full-length novel called Sparkling Cyanide or Remembered Death in 1945. And she changed the detective from Poirot to Colonel Race. So fascinating. I think it is really, really fascinating when stuff like that happens. Then we have a Miss Marple. Miss Marple tells a story. Now this one is told in the first person. She is recounting a murder that she solved a few years before to her nephew Raymond and his husband and his wife Joan. This was originally commissioned as a radio story, and it was actually read by Agatha Christie on the BBC in 1934. So I find that fascinating that she was reading Miss Marple in the first person on the radio. I thought that was really interesting. Then it was published in a magazine in 1935. And again, what comes out is her knowledge of human nature, which is classic in Miss Marple. Then we have The Dream, which is a Poirot story. Poirot goes to see a man named Farley who relates a strange dream in which he kills himself. Here's a great quote. "I wonder if you'll ever commit a crime, Poirot," said Stillingfleet, who is the police officer. "I bet you could get away with it all right. As a matter of fact, it would be too easy for you. I mean, the thing would be off as definitely too unsporting." Very interesting. And that was originally published in 37 in a magazine. Then we have a standalone short story called In a Glass Darkly, which is also first person, which was really interesting. In that one, the main character, he sees something in a mirror. So there's a great quote in that story. "I do not approve of murder," said Hercule Poirot. I thought that was great. That one was originally published in 1936 in the Strand magazine as Poirot and the Crime in Cabin 66. Now, there were a couple things that I highlighted in here. So in The Mystery of the Baghdad Chest, this is one with Poirot and Hastings. Hastings is the narrator in this one, and I thought there was this hilarious bit about Poirot. He says, "But my friend, I am not an Anglo-Saxon. Why should I play the hypocrite? That is what you do, all of you." And he talks about how British people don't like commending themselves. And he says, "They would admire the exploit in someone else. So, being reasonable men, they admire it in themselves, but their training prevents them from saying so. Me, I am not like that. The talents that I possess, I would salute them in another. As it happens, in my own particular line, there is no one to touch me. As it is, I admit freely and without the hypocrisy that I am a great man. I have the order, the method, and the psychology in an unusual degree. I am, in fact, Hercule Poirot. Why should I turn red and stammer and mutter into my chin that really I am very stupid? It would not be true. Okay, I have to say, I love Poirot. I mean, yes, he is very, very conceited. But the thing is, in this case, he's also just stating a fact. Like, he is brilliant and a very, very good detective. And he is just okay with saying that. And then Hastings says, there certainly is only one Hercule Poirot, I agreed. Not without a spice of malice, of which fortunately Poirot remained quite oblivious. And then on the very next page, to see Poirot at a party was a great sight. His faultless evening clothes, the exquisite set of his white tie, the exact symmetry of his hair parting, the sheen of pomade on his hair, and the tortured splendor of his famous mustaches, all combined to paint the perfect picture of an inveterate dandy. It was hard at these moments to take the little man seriously. Oh man. So good. Alright, so the standalone book In a Glass Darkly, I loved how this short story opened. I've no explanation of this story. I've no theories about the why and wherefore of it. It's just a thing that happened. All the same, I sometimes wonder how things would have gone if I'd noticed at the time just that one essential detail that I never appreciated until so many years afterwards. If I had noticed it, well, I suppose the course of 3 lives would have been entirely altered. Somehow, that's a very frightening thought. So there you go. Those are the 3 Agatha Christie's that I've read most recently. I am currently reading Sad Cypress and really enjoying it. So let's chat. Have you read any of those 3 books? I would love to talk with you about them in the comment section down below. And let's play another round of my M&M manuscript matchup game. We'll give that a shake. All right. Yellow. Yellow gives us cover. And yellow again. All right, so we need to find a cover that has yellow on it. Yellow again, so no repeat rule. Someone in the comments just recently asked if there were any yellow in here, and they're all coming out now. All right, brown gives us miscellaneous. Okay, very fun. And blue gives us animal. Okay, so we need to find a mystery that has yellow on the cover and involves an animal. I would love to see what you find that fit those prompts. Put your answers please in the comment section down below, and I will see you for another video very soon. Bye.